This week's episode of the ArtTactic Podcast is brought to you by ArtTactic.com, where we've just redesigned our entire website. Make sure to check it out, and any reports or subscriptions you buy, make sure to use the promo code PODCAST15 to get a 15% discount for our podcast listeners. Thanks for listening to the ArtTactic Podcast. I'm your host, Adam Green. Before diving into this week's conversation, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the devastating fires that have swept through Los Angeles. Our hearts go out to everyone affected. These fires have profoundly impacted the LA art community, with many artists, collectors, and art world professionals losing their homes, studios, and collections. It's been both heartbreaking and at the same time inspiring to witness the art world rally together through various fundraising efforts to support those in need during this challenging time. In this week's episode of the podcast, we're joined by Pogrebin, culture reporter for the New York Times. Robin previously lived in Los Angeles and has covered the LA art scene extensively. Interestingly, I reached out to Robin about chatting with us a few days before the fires began, as I wanted to speak with her about how Frieze LA has helped transform LA's art scene. But given the current circumstances, our discussion went into a variety of directions. We explored not only Frieze LA's influence, but also, of course, we discussed the fire's impact on the art community and the uncertainty surrounding whether the upcoming art fairs in LA will proceed as scheduled. My hope is that they will. Beyond the economic significance, I think these fairs could provide an opportunity for the art world to come together in solidarity, supporting the city's art businesses and artists during a time of need. We hope you enjoy the conversation with Robin. Thanks so much for listening. Robin, thanks so much for joining us.
Happy to be here.
So I think we have to start with the fires in LA. And to give a little bit of context about this episode, you lived in LA in the past, and when I reached out about recording the episode, it was really supposed to be entirely focused on Frieze LA and its positive impact on the LA art scene. You wrote a great article covering this topic in the Times last month. But after we scheduled the recording, the fire started in LA, so I think it's important that we focus on them as well. And you and your colleagues at the Times, I have to say, have done a great job reporting on the fires and their profound impact on the art community. Can you share the degree to which artists and institutions have been affected by these events, and how has the art world responded to support those impacted?
So there's, a lot to say on this subject because it has impacted LA on several levels, and all of them, pretty severe. In terms of the artists, most immediately, many have lost their homes and their studios, particularly in the neighborhood of Altadena, which is kind of near the Pacific Palisades. It's very much of kind of an insular, almost utopian community of people who know their neighbors. It includes some prominent artists like Paul McCarthy and his daughter and son, who live nearby each other, but also several other artists because it's somewhat more affordable than other neighborhoods. And that area was completely decimated by the fires. There's, maybe two houses left standing. And so that's just a huge impact on a population of people who can't easily rebuild, perhaps the way some of the people can in the Pacific Palisades, which was the other neighborhood that was kind of in a wholesale way eliminated. So that's been particularly dire, and there are some funds to try to help those artists, regain what they have. But as you probably know, insurance issues are going to be incredibly difficult at this point. Already, it was hard to get insurance in a lot of these areas that were already considered threatened, given mudslides and the potential for fires. So that's been difficult. There are also many collectors in LA, and most of them are concentrated in areas like Beverly Hills and Bel Air and Brentwood, but there were some in the Palisades. And we ran one story today about a collector and dealer of Warhol prints who lost everything. And I'm sure there are others that we haven't even heard of yet, whose art has been impacted because the fires hit the Pacific Palisades so quickly. There was no time to evacuate. There was barely time to evacuate people, let alone artwork. Um, and then what you do have is this kind of smoke implications for all the art that is still, existent and safe on the walls. Is that, there's particles in the air. And I know a lot of collectors are currently engaged in moving their art to safer spaces because they are worried about smoke damage. And it's also going to be harder to make those insurance claims because the more dire needs are going to take precedence. So there's just, a lot of levels of the art world that have been hurt by this. And there's also the question of the Frieze Art Fair, which has kind of recently come to Los Angeles. They have iterations in New York and London. And so it was important for LA to have that fair. It was an international gathering moment for the art world in Los Angeles, and it's scheduled for next month. And, the question of whether that will happen or not really hangs in the balance. And you hear two arguments. One is that it would be a real kind of rallying cry for it to move forward because it would be good for the galleries there and the artists. On the other hand, it feels kind of tone deaf to have a fair to art and to sell and buy art at this time when people are kind of worrying about where they're going to live.
Right. And I've had several conversations with galleries and collectors since the fires began. And right now there's a lot of speculation about whether the upcoming fairs will take place. While the rebuilding process from the devastation will undoubtedly take years, I'm hopeful that the fairs can still happen and that late February allows enough time. If they do proceed, I think it could be an important moment for the art world to come together in solidarity, visiting LA to support the artists, the galleries, and the broader art scene. Do you have a sense yet of whether the fairs are likely to happen, or is it still too early to know?
I mean, I think that they are really debating it now. And what's hard is that on some level, they need to make a decision sooner rather than later because there are so many preparations involved. Namely, all these galleries ship art to LA for the fair, and you have to kind of do that in advance. There are insurance issues and a lot of costs and investment involved in that. There's also the Felix Art Fair, which takes place at the Hollywood Roosevelt Hotel, which at one point was somewhat threatened. That's in a different neighborhood from the main LA Frieze, which is at the Santa Monica Airport. And that's a kind of lower end fair in terms of price point, but important again for artists to get that platform and the visibility and exposure to collectors they might not otherwise encounter. So there's just a lot at stake in terms of those fairs. But I think there's also this aspect to it that it is about commerce. And, you have other, elements of the art world, like the museums and the galleries. And it's just a question of, kind of why move forward with the art sale when all this other stuff hasn't really been resolved as to how artists are going to make a living going forward. And not all of the artists who work in LA would necessarily be featured in those fairs. So it doesn't necessarily, there isn't like a clear line from those who were impacted to the fairs and how that might benefit them.
Absolutely. Well, we'll just have to wait and see how things unfold. And so when I initially reached out to you about coming onto the podcast, it was because I found your article in the Times about the state of LA's art ecosystem and the impact of Frieze Week to be incredibly insightful, and I wanted to dig into that further with you. So for the sake of this conversation, let's assume the fairs will take place this year. Frieze LA, it's been a remarkable success, I think. Frieze Week in particular. It's really not just about the fair, but there's a whole lineup of events spanning the museums, the galleries, studio visits. And I think unlike many other fairs that feel more regional, Frieze LA has attracted collectors not just from around the US, but even beyond. In your view, what is it about LA that's enabled it to cultivate such a dynamic and far-reaching ecosystem around Frieze Week?
Well, LA has, they are they bristle at the idea that we keep, sort of the intelligentsia keeps kind of anointing LA as having arrived when they feel as if they arrived long ago. And there certainly is a long history of artists making work in LA because there are all these great art schools there, and just so many important artists have come out of there, like John Baldessari and Barbara Kruger and just so many others, Ed Ruscha. But what has kind of taken off recently is kind of the commercial aspect of the art world. A lot more galleries opening there, opening branches, galleries that, let's say, are some of the mega galleries like Hauser and Wirth, and David Zwirner very recently opened there in a very large space with like 3 different buildings. So those are kind of just votes of confidence in the city to some extent. And then also the museums have really strengthened. You have, the Broad, which is now expanding with a, $100 million expansion and, lines around the block. You have, a new director at MoCA who, finally after kind of a revolving door of directors, seems to be stabilizing things. You have LACMA getting ready to open its new expansion, which has, been long awaited and is supposed to actually open in 2026. You have this narrative museum that was established by the filmmaker George Lucas, and we're waiting for that to open, and it's supposed to be 2026. And, you just have the Getty is sort of a little more active in with, Pacific Standard Time, which is this, huge kind of art event that it does every few years that organizes the entire city. So there's just a feeling like the activity has escalated and stepped up. You do have more artists moving there because there's a slightly more affordable cost of living. You can get more space, and the light is clearly something artists appreciate. So it just has felt like things are percolating in LA. It's just been an upward trajectory, and there's going to be a real question about how much of a setback the fires are in that regard. But the fair was important because, it did move beyond the local community to be a magnet for those from elsewhere in the country and in the world. People in the art world famously like to be around one another. They don't want to miss a party. And there's this real sort of density that happens with an art fair where it's kind of one-stop shopping in a way that's efficient for collectors and also just has an energy of its own. There are parties and events around it. And it's particularly helpful for LA because it is such a diffuse city. I mean, it just famously, it's hard to get from one side of the city to another. There are collectors who live on the west side. That's where most collectors are concentrated, and they don't really have an appetite for sitting in traffic for up to 2 hours to go to the east side. So this just, and the kind of the gallery crawl that you can do in Chelsea in New York, where you can hit several galleries in a day because they're all, one after another on streets in the 20s. There's nothing comparable to that in LA. There are all these different pockets of galleries spread out over the entire city. So Frieze LA just gives you an opportunity to go to one place, park in one location, and see it all for the day. And that's a big deal.
Yeah, I mean, LA offers really an array of art attractions at this point, but it's so sprawling it can be a challenge to navigate. I mean, whenever I visit, I always kind of check my FOMO and I try to see as much as I can, but I know I'll never see everything I want to see. It's really unlike New York, right, where you can easily head to a neighborhood like Chelsea or Tribeca and see as many galleries as you want. LA requires a lot more planning, whether it's for myself or clients. I always map it out in advance to try to create an order itinerary to maximize what we can see and minimize time spent in traffic. And I think with so much happening in LA's art scene, Frieze Week really has become that perfect time to visit. It's not just about the Frieze Fair. It's an entire week or an entire few days filled with museums, galleries, and other events. And it's in February, where it's more likely to be colder in the winter in some place outside of LA. So I think it's a fantastic time to be there. I wanted to dive in a little bit more about the gallery scene with you. LA, it's experienced a wave of gallery expansions in recent years, but it's also seen a noticeable number of closures recently. How significant of an issue do you think that is, and What do you think is driving that dynamic? Why are so many galleries ambitiously expanding to LA, only for some to struggle to survive?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's this interesting juxtaposition in LA where there are a lot of artists there. Those artists want to be represented by their galleries where they live. And so there is this real impetus for galleries to open spaces and sell art where the artists are making the art. And I think that really explains a lot of why have seen galleries opening. And it's also important for these galleries because they otherwise worry about losing the artists to other local galleries that are fulfilling that need. On the other hand, the reality of LA is there's just not a lot of foot traffic. That's not really how people buy art in LA, because, as I said, getting in your car and going from one gallery to another can be really daunting on traffic days. And every collector I speak to there talks about how they have to really kind of strategize as to where they're going to go, and they can't hit more than one neighborhood in a day. It's just too difficult in terms of traffic. And so I think to some extent the galleries are symbolic in LA, which is sort of an interesting idea because it seems like a costly symbol to actually have brick and mortar spaces. But the reality is the economics kind of work for the big ones because you can sell a few very expensive paintings and cover the costs of your building structure in LA. That's not so true for smaller and mid-sized galleries where it's going to be harder to make those economics work, to actually have a space where you have to pay rent and cover costs, and if you're selling at a lower price point. So I think that is the balance that they're trying to figure out, and some can't manage it and some can.
And while LA is getting more attention for its art scene, I do think a lot of people in the art world, maybe they just go once a year during Frieze Week, or they don't even go annually. I'm curious, do you think there are any common misperceptions about the LA art market or the art scene and how it operates? And if so, how do these differ from the reality of working and collecting in Los Angeles?
I mean, I think there is, in the sense that, I do hear that a lot of collectors still buy in New York, even though they live in LA. There is a whole world of people buying from PDFs now anyway, so the actual physical transaction is not necessarily as essential as it used to be. But I also think that there are collectors we all may not know about the same way that we do those who are sort of more prominent in New York and showing up at the auctions in New York and in London, that there might be just kind of a lower profile to those collectors. I certainly met some of them when I was there and toured their homes, and they have some very significant, impressive things. But my sense is that they kind of keep it on the down low, perhaps for security reasons. And I think that also there is just, the art world in LA, as vital as it is ultimately trumped by Hollywood. I think, that is the main game in town. It is kind of the industry that really that dominates. And I think that the art world, somewhat suffers from that. Like it's never quite going to get the same level of sort of public traction that Hollywood does, because, Hollywood is very much about celebrity. And, in New York, people in the art world are celebrities. In LA, they somewhat, pale in comparison to a Brad Pitt or a Jennifer Lopez.
So Frieze Week is currently set to occur at the end of February. Assuming it does happen, are there any particularly noteworthy events at this year's edition that you think listeners should not miss?
Well, it's interesting because we were going to do a whole LA Frieze special section, which we now have decided not to do just because the whole thing is so uncertain, which is kind of unfortunate. So I was kind of trolling around for sort of what's the angle this year. And I was in contact with them, and they did highlight a few things that seemed interesting. One was they plan to center Indigenous voices and highlight Indigenous artists at Frieze. And so that it really kind of serves as a platform for those perspectives. They also wanted to kind of focus on the legacy of Santa Monica and how that area of LA has a rich artistic heritage. and to kind of connect it with Frieze's location at the Santa Monica airport. As you may recall, it originated at Paramount Studios, Frieze LA, and then moved to the airport. And some kind of bemoan that shift because it was so evocative to do the fair on a studio lot. But I guess that didn't ultimately prove viable in terms of space and other considerations. And then also the artist Lauren Halsey was taking over the not-for-profit tent at Frieze to offer a glimpse of Summa Everything, which is the community center she's building in South Central LA. And so that piece is supposed to highlight her vision. And also there are like acquisitions that take place at Frieze, where institutions, come and buy things and kind of announce those acquisitions. The California African American Museum has done that in the past. And so it makes an important connection between kind of the commerce of Frieze LA, but also the institutional support of local LA institutions, museums.
Well, hopefully Frieze Week does occur and everyone who isn't in LA can come and visit and show their support for the art community there. Robin, thanks so much again for coming onto the podcast and updating us on the fires in LA, as well as hearing your thoughts on Frieze's positive impact on the art ecosystem in Los Angeles. If our listeners don't follow you yet on social media or in the Times, where can we find you?
I'm at Pogrebin on Instagram. And I'm also on Twitter at that handle. And I'm at Pogrebin at NY Times is my email. And yes, please follow my stories. Thanks.
Perfect. Thanks so much again, Robin. We really appreciate it.
Okay, thank you.